I'm Nima Rajan. Elections Canada says most of the 850,000 mailed-in votes for the federal election have been counted, but there are still a few close ridings not yet called. Several ridings were declared Liberal victories last night, including Fredericton, Edmonton Centre, Northwest Territories, Yukon, and the Toronto riding of Davenport. An automatic recount is expected in a West Winnipeg riding where Conservative incumbent Marty Morantz beat out Liberal Doug Ielfson by just 24 votes. Elections officials say all final numbers may not be known until Friday. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau says Canada is ready to fulfill its commitment to support equitable access to COVID-19 vaccines, tests, and treatments. Mr. Trudeau made the statement following a virtual vaccine summit at the United Nations General Assembly. The reassurance comes as further deliveries of COVID-19 vaccines have been put on hold. Canada is already sitting on a stockpile of 18.7 million doses, and talks are ongoing to donate the excess. CBRE Group says the national office vacancy rate hit 15.7% in the third quarter. This is the highest level since 1994. The commercial real estate firm says that a fourth wave has slowed an expected return to work. The story is quite different on the industrial front, where vacancies are low as demand for distribution and logistics space remains at an all-time high. A report examining BC's response to the record 2017 and 2018 wildfire seasons says the province needs to shore up communications with remote and Indigenous communities. The Thompson Rivers University report recommends improving internet services to remote communities, or at least supplying local officials with a satellite phone so wildfire information can be relayed promptly. The Northwest Territories is introducing stricter public health measures and extending current orders as the territory continues to deal with an outbreak of COVID-19. Starting Saturday, public gatherings in the capital of Yellowknife and surrounding areas will be limited to 10 people indoors, which is down from 25. All schools and non-essential businesses will remain closed until at least October 4th. One of Saskatchewan's main farm groups hopes the new Liberal minority government will get cracking on legislation to help the agriculture sector. Todd Lewis of the Agricultural Producers Association of Saskatchewan says two private members' bills that died in the Senate when the election was called should be resurrected. They include a bill regarding farm trespassing, as well as legislation that would create an exemption in the carbon tax for fuels used in grain drying. Ontario's premier has called on the justice system to get its act together after news that bail has been granted to the man accused of killing a Toronto police officer. Umar Zamir was charged with first-degree murder in the July 2nd death of 55-year-old Constable Jeffrey Northrup. The officer died after being struck by a vehicle in what investigators have called a deliberate act. Premier Doug Ford tweeted that Wednesday's granting of bail for Mr. Zamir is beyond comprehension. He urged the justice system to put victims and their families ahead of criminals. The manager of a Montreal long-term care home where 47 residents died during the first wave of the COVID-19 pandemic told a coroner's inquiry today that staffing issues played a part in the crisis. Andre Stanica says the replacement of experienced staff at Residence Heron with workers from a temp agency and the lack of a director of care contributed to what happened. English and French school boards in Newfoundland and Labrador have cancelled public exams for all grades for the current school year. The Department of Education says the move will ensure student assessment takes possible impacts of COVID-19 disruptions into account. It says teachers have focused on alternate means of assessment in lieu of standardized testing during the pandemic, and that has had a positive impact on attendance, learning, and students' well-being. CIBC has unveiled a new logo inspired by its 1966 double chevron design that was created to celebrate the bank's 100-year anniversary. CIBC has updated its logo in 2003, and it says the rebrand comes after it has expanded its platform across North America. The Toronto-based bank says it is now focused on, quote, meeting the needs and expectations of clients on both sides of the border. The Canadian Hockey League has confirmed the 2022 Memorial Cup will be hosted by the St. John Sea Dogs in New Brunswick. The COVID-19 pandemic forced the cancellation of the tournament for the past 2 years. As part of the tournament, the Sea Dogs will compete with the champions of the Ontario Hockey League, the Western Hockey League, and the Quebec Major Junior Hockey League. All right, we'll be right back after the break. Coming up, we have the weekly market recap with Catherine Murray, the host of The Buck Stops Here. So stay with us. That and, of course, more news from around the world only on Forum Daily News. Stay tuned. After a short break, we'll be right back. All right, welcome back. Right now on Forum Daily, we have the weekly market recap with Catherine Murray. Catherine Murray hosts The Buck Stops Here, where she unpacks matters that affect Canadian businesses, the markets, and Canadian pocketbooks. She joins us now for the weekly market recap.
Thanks, Nima. Hello and welcome to your weekly market recap. I'm Catherine Murray. Well, markets certainly have been choppy, volatile, and in a downtrend for the past number of weeks. And that did continue at the beginning of this week with a global sell-off to the tune of 2%. On fears that one of China's largest property developers, Evergrande, would default on their interest payments. This really sparked fears around the world that we could be seeing a Lehman-like event, which is what sparked the financial crisis back in 2008. However, the consensus view now is that the Chinese government will in fact be able to contain any type of contagion. The other aspect is there's a belief that there won't be a contagion, that it really has to do with China and is not spreading to North America or Europe. That was one of the key drivers, of course, of the markets this week, and we've seen them rebound with that thinking. At the same time, I would just point out that today in China, the Chinese authorities are actually warning the local governments that they could be prepared or need to be prepared for some type of storm given Evergrande's demise. So just be aware of that as well. It's not done. It's a fluid situation. The other key driver to the markets this week was the FOMC, or the U.S. Federal Reserve, which met yesterday. The headlines will tell you that it was somewhat of a hawkish statement because the FOMC provided advance notice that tapering may soon be warranted. But the markets rallied. So that's either telling you that the news was priced in, which is probably true. But the other aspect, which I believe more of, is that the U.S. Fed Chair Jerome Powell, in his own interest rate projections, is saying 0 hikes in 2022. That is actually a little bit more dovish than what the median projection is. The markets rallied on the back of this. Those U.S. markets were up 1 to 1.5%. TSX was up by 0.8%. Energy really led the rally, up by 3%. WTI settled up 2.5%. Financials also did well, and also cryptocurrencies. Now, the other big driver this week, of course, was the Canadian elections, but it wasn't a market driver at all. The only thing perhaps to note from a business perspective is that Canadians just spent $600 million on an election that really provided no change. Away from that, a couple of interesting headlines, business headlines to take note of. We know of shortages. Well, chip shortages, for one, likely to cost automakers approximately $200 billion. There's 21-week lead times. And also interesting news here that the FDA did authorize Pfizer-BioNTech's booster dose for certain people. Away from that, economic headlines, really important to note here as well. Initial jobless claims in the United States, this is a weekly number, 325,000 initial jobless claims. 200,000 was the pre-pandemic level. So there's still a ways to go on the job front in the United States. Also to note, Canadian retail sales were down for the third time in 4 months. The manufacturing and services data in Europe, the UK, Germany, and France, all disappointed, not meeting expectations, coming in below expectations. So that all of that taken together lends itself to the slower global growth story. That's been in the market. That's why we've seen these markets a little bit choppy and selling off. At the same time, we're also hearing out of the United States that perhaps the Delta variant is peaking. So that could bode well for markets going forward and that recovery story. A couple of notable stock stories to mention. Facebook, for one, is flagging the headwinds from Apple's privacy changes. So that stock was under a little bit of pressure. BlackBerry, they had better than expected results, sending that stock up by 9%. Also hearing that the iPhone orders are coming in above expectations. And another big bellwether stock to watch, which is pretty interesting, FedEx, that stock was down by 9%. You don't see big moves like that for such a large cap company. They did miss on earnings, and they also downgraded their full year guidance because they are citing higher wage inflation and inadequate staffing. We know that there's some issues with respect to getting back to work and labor shortages, and you're seeing it play out in some of these large cap companies. Tech Resources up 6.4%. It was upgraded over at BMO. Just be aware that the commodity cycle is in full force, it appears. People are talking about a super cycle. We'll see. Also, Bombardier got upgraded over at Goldman Sachs, sending that stock up. Take a look at that one. And BMO did cut their price targets on a number of the auto parts companies like Magna, Linamar, and Martinrea. And also just to note from a market perspective, the Canadian banks, they continue to do quite well from a performance perspective. And that is your weekly market recap. I'm Catherine Murray. Nima, back to you.
All right, thanks for that, Catherine. When we come back from the break, we'll take a look at the situation in Alberta's legislature. Premier Jason Kenney is facing a disgruntled caucus over the handling of the COVID-19 crisis. We speak with Vitor Marciano, government relations expert and former senior advisor to Alberta's Wild Rose Party. Up next, stay with us. Alberta Premier Jason Kenney did not face a vote of confidence despite being challenged by some of his legislator members for decisions made on COVID-19. This follows the move Tuesday to shuffle Health Minister Tyler Shandro out of his role. Some of Mr. Kenney's caucus members have criticized his health measures as being too little too late. Others say he has gone too far and violated individual rights by imposing a form of voluntary vaccine passports. The United Conservative Party's Vice President of Policy has already called for Mr. Kenney to resign. A Leger poll from earlier this month indicates that over 75% of Albertans polled support a vaccine passport system. Well, with us to talk more about this issue is Vitor Marciano, government relations professional and former senior advisor to Alberta's Wild Rose Party. Mr. Marciano, welcome to Forum Daily.
Pleasure to be here.
So let's start with the significance of this recent cabinet shuffle and what it means for the Alberta government.
I think it's an effort by Premier Kenney to buy a little bit of time to send some messages to his own party and to his own caucus that he does recognize that mistakes have been made. It was a signal to the caucus that things might change. It was still a muted signal in the sense that the former health minister, Shandro, wasn't removed from caucus. He was just shuffled with the new health minister. I think it's an effort to try to placate some of the anger that's surrounding the premier on these issues.
All right, sir. Well, Mr. Kenney did not face a vote of confidence yesterday, but is likely to face a leadership review at the UCP annual general meeting set for the spring. So can you give us a deeper background into the overall political situation facing Premier Kenney right now?
Premier Kenney's in a deep, troublesome spot. He's well behind in the polls. He's well behind in the polls in Edmonton. He's well behind in the polls in Calgary. He's behind in the polls now in rural Alberta. So he's losing all three legs of the political stool in Alberta. And he's found a way to anger people on both sides of this issue. So the people who want more restrictions, he's made them angry. The people who want less restrictions, he's made them angry. So he's in a position right now where he doesn't have a constituency or he doesn't have a base that's supporting him. And it's made it very, very difficult for him. I'd have a tough time figuring out how he could survive that leadership review when it comes. And the question is, it's almost a given he's going to lose it.
It does sound like a tricky situation, sir. Now, considering that Alberta's UCP is relatively a new union of two different parties, would you say this recent turmoil is revealing old divides?
No, surprisingly, that actually isn't the case. The effort that happened yesterday was actually led by brand new MLAs who didn't have their basis in either of the parties. So in many ways, they were UCPers rather than PCers or Wild Rosers. This is one of the problems that Premier Kenney is having, is that he's starting to lose the support of caucus members that he brought into caucus that were brand new to provincial politics and arrived with him. So he's already got some trouble with some of the folks who were there from before, from either the PC side or the Wild Rose side. Now, with him losing the support of brand new people that came in with him, it's going to become a complicated situation.
All right, so just about a minute and a half left. But jumping back to this Leger poll, 77% of Albertans support a vaccine passport system, but the UCP caucus is clearly divided on this issue. How do you see all of this playing out for Albertans and the UCP government as a whole?
Well, the problem with this is that in some ways the government's trying to suck and blow on the issue at the same time. They're giving people the vaccine passports, but trying not to call them a vaccine passport. The communication has been incredibly muddled, and it actually defeats one of the purposes of doing these sorts of steps. When you take these sorts of actions, it sends a message to everybody that this is a serious problem, that you're dealing with it in a serious way. When you take these actions in a half-hearted way and you hide them under veiled terms and you frame them the wrong way, you lose the psychological, motivational advantage of actually doing the actions. So, Albertans, by and large, would be okay with some form of vaccine passport. I don't think either the pro-passport or the anti-passport people are happy with how Jason Kenney has communicated this.
All right, sir, just about 40 seconds left here, but is there any way that the Premier can balance both the interests of Alberta and his party?
Well, I think he's trying to do that. I think in many ways it isn't the what of what he does, but he needs to improve his how. He's got to improve his communication. And Jason Kenney's been famous for being a communicator over the years. It's failing him a little bit right now. He needs to find a way to do it differently.
All right, Mr. Marciano, thank you again for your insight on Forum Daily. We'll be right back with our international segment. The U.S. Central Bank will be overhauling its financial policies, and China's Ant Group will be handing over private credit information to China's central bank. That and more coming up next. U.S. Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell says the central bank will overhaul its financial ethics policies. There are growing questions about investing and trading decisions by high-ranking Fed officials that raise potential conflicts of interest. Mr. Powell stopped short of saying explicitly that some trading moves were inappropriate, and he provided no details about what the Fed might do or how it would conduct its ethics review. China's central bank will soon have to access private credit information of hundreds of millions of users of Ant Group's online credit service. Huobai, Ant Group's credit service, said in a statement that consumer credit data it has collected will be included in the People's Bank of China's financial credit information database. The move is part of various regulations for Ant, which has been ordered to end its monopoly on information and behave more like a bank. Indonesia's president says inclusiveness and a sustainable green economy will be among his priorities when he assumes the G20 presidency next year. Joko Widodo committed to working for the benefit of all, including vulnerable groups. He called for countries to work together on health resources like funding and vaccines and standardizing health protocols for travel. Lithuanian cybersecurity experts are urging the country's government agencies to abandon the use of Chinese smartphone brands. The recommendation from the National Cybersecurity Center comes after an investigation found security vulnerabilities and censorship concerns with certain devices made by Huawei and Xiaomi. They say the risks involve pre-installed apps on the devices and possible issues with data leakage. Both companies deny the allegations. Fears that a Chinese real estate developer's possible default might send shockwaves through global financial markets appear to be easing. As details of Evergrande's $310 billion debt became clearer, economists said despite likely losses for Chinese banks and other creditors, it appears a default would not feed through to financial markets abroad. Chicago-based aerospace giant Boeing has announced plans to build a new type of drone military aircraft in Australia. Boeing says it has selected Queensland State as the final assembly point for its unmanned Loyal Wingman planes. The announcement comes less than a week after the U.S., Britain, and Australia announced the new AUKUS security alliance. Taiwan officials say the island has applied to join an 11-nation Pacific trade group, of which Canada is a member. That sets up a potential clash with rival Beijing. A Taiwan cabinet minister says the island's application to join the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership might be disrupted. This if China, which applied last week, is admitted first. China's ruling Communist Party claims Taiwan as part of its territory and says it has no right to conduct foreign relations. The head of the UN Food Agency is warning that 16 million people in Yemen are marching toward starvation. David Beasley spoke on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly gathering in New York yesterday. He said in Yemen's humanitarian crisis, food rations for millions in the war-torn nation will be cut in October unless new funding arrives. Only half of the UN's $3.85 billion appeal for Yemen has been funded. The World Health Organization says 90% of people live in areas with at least one harmful type of pollutant. The UN agency released its first updated air quality guidelines in 15 years today. It says the harmful health effects of air pollution kick in at lower levels than previously thought. Air pollution contributes to 7 million deaths a year and is now comparable to other global health risks like unhealthy diets and smoking tobacco. The U.S. government has released projections that indicate an even more troubling outlook for a river that serves 40 million people in the American West. The grim outlook Wednesday from the Bureau of Reclamation comes after it recently declared the first ever shortage on the Colorado River. That means Arizona, Nevada, and Mexico will get less water than normal next year. By 2025, the agency says there's a 66% chance that Lake Mead will fall to a level where California's supply also will be reduced. Scientists have found evidence of a resistant form of malaria in Uganda. It's a worrying sign that the top drug used against the parasitic disease could ultimately be rendered useless. Africa accounts for more than 90% of the world's malaria cases. The disease is spread by mosquito bites and kills more than 400,000 people every year, mostly children under 5 and pregnant women. Researchers at MIT are using barnacles as their inspiration to attempt to save some of the 1.9 million people who die from blood loss every year. The team from MIT was inspired by barnacles and their oil, which can adhere to practically any surface. Long-term study still remains to be done, but the material could fill major needs in emergency rooms and even among aging populations. All right, that'll do it for your look at national and international news for today. Remember, for more news on demand, you could always visit our website, thenewsforum.ca, or follow us on our social media handles on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Take care, Canada.